Welcome to Paul Weiss Waking Up with AI, a podcast from Paul Weiss featuring your host, Katherine Forrest. The only update you need on AI policy, law, and governance starts now.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what is the 100th episode of Paul Weiss Waking Up with AI. I'm Katherine Forrest.
And I'm Scott Caravello. Katherine, can you believe it?
100. And Scott, did you dress up for it? I think I see you in a tie. Like nobody wears a tie.
Exactly. I had to do something special. I'm happy to be a part of this.
And by the way, after 100 episodes, and I think this is the first episode for which you've actually worn a tie, I'm not sure that I'm seeing the coffee cups that are like the symbol of this whole beautiful thing, waking up with AI. Like I've got my coffee cup in my hand.
I have to admit, I'm a bit embarrassed. I don't have any mugs in the office. I think after this, I will come by to get one of the Waking Up with AI mugs, and I will have you sign it to commemorate
Right.
that this is the 100th episode.
Right. Okay, I'll sign it, and then it'll probably just wipe right off. But in the meantime, I'm also impressed that not only did you come here for the 100th episode in a shirt and tie, but that you wore a shirt and tie when there's like, I don't know, 14, 18, however many gazillion of inches there are outside of snow on the ground.
I know. Fortunately, I made it through unscathed on the subway.
It's a yeah. You know what I do actually in the wintertime when it's like I resort to the tried and true meal that everyone should have. There's actually 2 tried and true meals. One is, of course, chili, and so we made a white chili this weekend that was phenomenal. It's with chicken, but then also lasagna, and so things are a little tighter than they were before last week. But anyway, time to move on to our tech now. What is our special 100th episode tech talk today, Scott?
Well, it is something that has gotten a lot of buzz lately, and that is memory, which I don't know if we've talked about on the podcast before, but is a really important part of the AI tech stack and the hardware side specifically. And so we'll talk a little bit about those chips and how they play a role in the compute pillar and what is happening around memory at the moment.
Yeah, you gotta love the phrase compute pillar. There's so many like lovely phrases that only exist in the tech world, the compute pillar. But anyway, we have talked about chips in the past, but we haven't really talked about memory in a dedicated way. So let's just sort of dive right into it or jump right into it or walk our way into it. So we, I think, are all familiar with the concept of compute. And that's, really combination of things that has to do with computational power, the hardware, the chips, all of the things that make the processing occur for here in our world, for the AI tools and the AI models. But we've been getting a lot of interesting information recently on how memory is dealt with in AI.
Right. And so that's because to run a model, you have to actually be able to store the model, including its weights. And so that's the role of the memory chips, and at least as we're going to talk about it today. And so those storage demands, along with other important functions that are performed by those chips, are driving a big challenge in the AI supply chain, which is shaping up to be an important topic this year and, maybe stretching it to next year. And so it's also therefore probably going to play a very important role in shaping the AI investment landscape this year.
Exactly. So just to sort of pause for a moment and sort of talk about memory and the types of memory in AI, let's sort of lay them out. First, we've got a certain amount of memory in the training process, and that is learned before deployment. So it's what the AI model has learned. It's not about recalling specific documents or specific information that's been fed in the way it's been fed in. It's the training and the memory that is used to store the training in the models and weights. Then there's the context memory, which is akin to working or short term memory that's actively holding inside, for instance, the context window that we've talked about in other episodes. It's holding that information inside. Then there's a kind of temporary storage That's session or tool memory storage. And then there's a relatively straightforward, very small amount of memory for a user profile memory. So it remembers sort of who we are. And there's a different amount of that that's actually retained with different models. And then there's something called really a model state, which is not a classic kind of memory, but it's the electrical activity that's sort of the brain thinking. So it's not persistent memory. But with all of that, let's sort of go back and talk about two things, which is RAM, which is something that a lot of people who are familiar with computers are familiar with. And then we're going to get to something called high bandwidth memory, or HBM. But let's talk about RAM first and sort of set the stage there, and then move into the AI specific high bandwidth memory, which is really what makes everything move so quickly. And so with RAM, we know that the way that computers temporarily store information that's going to be processed is with RAM, and that's sort of the most commonly thought of kind of memory. And, RAM is needed to hold the model weights, but it doesn't actually run the computation. That's going to be run by something that we're going to call high bandwidth memory, the HBM that we're going to get to in a moment. So, we've got this RAM that is able to pull on or pull up past information, which is also often occurring in the context of agents and developers and deployers storing information about the models, like the weights, to run the model. And so we've got a sort of an initial piece that sort of is our starter pack of memory, which is our RAM.
Right. And so then just circling back really quickly, Catherine, on one type of memory that you had mentioned when you're talking about the context window, right? And sort of hitting on why that's so important and why memory is so important right now is because besides the fact that you just need to be able to access what the model had learned in training, is also the fact that AI agents require so much context to run and to understand, what they're doing, how they plan. And so as agents continue to get rolled out, this memory is playing an increasingly important role. And so then going sort of to what you had mentioned about the high bandwidth memory is that you actually need to be able to access that memory. And so that high bandwidth memory, or HBM, it helps make that access happen fast and answer your queries fast.
Right. And so I think we'll go on a little but important tangent right here on something called, and we've mentioned it in prior episodes, called the mixture of experts, or MOE, and how MOE models fit into this picture and in explaining memory. So, we know that, for instance, Gemini 3.0 is an MOE model, and the MOE models are composed of a large set of total parameters, but the point of a mixture of experts is that only a smaller set or a subset of those parameters are activated at any particular time. So in an MOE model, you're just running parts of the model that are useful for an appropriate, for a particular query or input. But there's a catch, which is even though a smaller number of parameters get activated, and there's a lower, sort of pure computational cost, all of the parameters get loaded into or stored in the memory.
Right. So whatever way you splice it and dice it, there is no getting around the need for memory, especially as the MOE mixture of experts models become more popular.
Right, right, right. And so there's a takeaway here, which is obviously that a lot of models have become or are just closed source, and developers don't always disclose the specific details about their architecture. But there are some models like DeepSeek's models and Llama models that are MOE. And because they're open source, you can actually learn a lot more about them. So, as I've said, we think that Gemini is an MOE. It's actually mentioned as an MOE, and it's become sort of an industry standard frontier model. So it's utilizing memory in the way that we've just talked about.
Yeah, and so as these cutting edge models continue to get larger and as the demand grows in the inference market, that is more people are sending model queries and using these models, we are starting to see some major headwinds in the memory market.
Right. So let's just now circle back to the memory, which is there's a really interesting consumer electronics show, which everybody probably knows about if you read Wired Magazine or any number of business publications. And that consumer electronics show is called CES. And at CES this year, the business chief of Micron, and Micron, by the way, as we know, is one of the major memory suppliers, he said, quote, "We have seen a very sharp, significant surge in demand for memory, and it has far outpaced our ability to supply that memory and, in our estimation, the supply capability of the whole memory industry," end quote.
And that is a pretty big statement. But, notwithstanding that crunch, the industry is taking steps to address the memory capacity. And so last month, SK Hynix, I think that's how it's pronounced, which is one of the other three major memory suppliers, just announced a $13 billion investment in a new plant while citing figures that showed a 33% compound annual growth rate in the high bandwidth memory market. And they're also building facilities too, right? Micron is building two factories, or also known as fabs, in Boise, Idaho, and another in Clay, New York. But even despite all of that, Micron is saying that it is sold out for 2026. And, that's because these fabs do take time to be built and come online.
All right, now let's go back to that word or the phrase that you used there, which was the 33% compound annual growth rate for the high bandwidth memory market. That's the HBM that you and I were talking about before. And those are the chips that are in the GPU, the graphics processing unit attached to memory. And they are ultra fast and they are designed for massive parallel processing. They are not RAM, but they're sort of RAM adjacent. AI models use both HBM, this high bandwidth memory, and RAM. And RAM sort of manages the HBM. It's sort of at the beginning and at the end. The CPU prepares the user input in RAM, and the model weights and parameters they move to the high bandwidth memory, to the HBM. And that's where all the magic occurs, inside and with the HBM and utilizing the HBM. And then the output gets passed back to the RAM at the end. So the thinking is happening and the speed of the thinking is happening inside of the HBM.
Right. And, the reason that everyone knows about RAM already is because it is part of our consumer devices. And so I want to make another note on RAM, which is that RAM and HBM in the AI context are really interconnected with RAM in the consumer context too, as we talk about this memory shortage. Micron, for example, has stated that for every unit of HBM it produces, it has to forego producing 3 units of regular memory. So basically, the entire memory market, not just in AI, is affected by this surge in demand.
Right. So that means if you're going to go off and did you ever build your own PC?
No, I did not.
You did not. I didn't either, but I have friends whose kids have built their own PCs. Actually, I have my stepson who built
It's pretty
own.
amazing.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. But if you're going to be doing that in the near future, you're going to find that the cost for RAM may have gone up a little bit. So if this is not relevant to you, Scott, we can just go ahead and move on.
No, it's not super relevant to me, but I think it's really interesting to talk about because some stores are now selling RAM at market prices, like exactly how you buy lobster at a seafood restaurant. And that's an analogy that The Verge used, so I'm not going to take credit for it, but it really does work. And, according to their reporting, a message in one store display case reads, "Costs are fluctuating daily as manufacturers and distributors adjust to limited supply and high demand. Because of this, we can't display fixed prices at this time," which really, really is pretty crazy. And so practically speaking, prices for that consumer RAM were already tripling or quadrupling as of a few months ago. And so now we're in this kind of dynamic pricing environment. And then one other note, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Katherine. But that's just that these memory chip manufacturers have, because of this, made a hot area for investment. And Micron's stock was up 247% year over year in January.
Okay, so I just have to say, at first, I did not have any idea where you were going with that lobster analogy. And then I realized what you're talking about is that lobster is not sold typically at like X, Y, or Z per pound. It's sold at market rates. Okay. And that's what you're saying. You're saying that
Yeah.
the prices are moving so quickly in different directions. They're relatively volatile, so to speak, that, okay, so that it's like lobster.
So do you think we can say safely that for episode 100, it's the first time that lobster has been brought up on this podcast?
I don't know, I've done a lot of these episodes from Maine, so it's possible. I don't remember a lobster episode. So anyway, let's talk about how, the research is looking and how AI is changing the dynamics of the memory market. So for decades now, the memory industry, because we've needed memory for computers for decades, right? Forever, has been driven by demand in the consumer market, as you were saying before. And you were talking before about how, you need memory for smartphones and personal computers and all of that. We just haven't had as memory hungry a series of applications until AI just a couple of years ago. And now the AI is ubiquitous. It's also resulting in enormous numbers of new consumer products. So we've really got a whole change in the demand landscape for the AI tools that use memory. It's not just the models and the tools that are being used in business, but there are a whole load of toys and consumer devices and smart home devices, all of which now are utilizing memory.
And so just transitioning off of that point, Catherine, right? Because of that market impact, it's probably going to implicate other pillars of AI development too, like the algorithms themselves. Because AI developers need all this memory, there's certainly R&D being done to reduce the amount that's required by major models. So we might see other downstream shifts. And so what's our takeaway, Catherine?
Well, what's our takeaway, Scott?
It's that memory is going to be a significant bottleneck for AI in 2026, and we have not heard the last of this. We're going to see if there are tech developments, again, like I mentioned with algorithms, to try and address it. But this memory wall that's been talked about for years is a key issue to keep on the radar.
You see, I like your articulation of that takeaway. That's a good articulation of that takeaway. And that's all we've got time for today. Ending our 100th episode, I'm Katherine Forrest.
And I'm Scott Caravello. If you're enjoying the podcast, please like and subscribe.
Thanks for listening to Paul Weiss Waking Up with AI. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app to stay up to date on the latest in AI policy, law, and governance. For more information on Paul Weiss, go to our website at www.paulweiss.com.